Thank you, Mdu. I'm going to have to step to one side and teach you how to pronounce Otu, and I think I've lived with it my entire life, so it's like almost second nature. And I've noticed quite a few people have difficulty, even South Africans, with the name of that town. But be that as may. But first of all, I'd like to, on behalf of the Polish Association of Siberian Deportees in Africa and the South Africa-Poland History Project, I wish to express my extreme gratitude to Tali Natus and her team for once again hosting this conference. I have to admit, I thought I wouldn't be here in the actual physical building, but I was able to come here, and it's almost like it's a home to me, this lovely museum. It's a living museum. Okay, but once again, thank you to a superb team that has helped put together this conference. What I also appreciate is the attention to detail that the team has applied to the whole thing. Attention to detail resonates with me. So thank you very much to the team here at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Right, now, as Mdu's mentioned, the topic for today is Siberia, searching for stolen childhood narratives. And I think there's a couple of maybe key words that one should take note of in this topic: Siberia, stolen narratives. And hopefully during the course of the afternoon, you'll get some insight as to what the context of this topic is. Now, I want to spend some time, just a little bit of time, talking about Siberia as a concept. And what does it mean, and what should it mean to Polish people? Here I want to refer to a Polish poet, essayist, writer, and moralist, Zbigniew Herbert, who quoted, "The loss of memory by a nation is also a loss of its conscience. The loss of memory by a nation is also a loss of its conscience." I find that like powerful stuff. I think also it's a case of one has to go back in history, and Siberia as a concept has played a substantial portion of Poland's history the last 200-300 years. And here we need to go back to the late 1700s, when Poland was partitioned by the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian empires. Now, these empires invaded, annexed, and colonized various parts of Poland. And the Russian colonization of Poland, of its portion of Poland, was quite brutal. And in the third partitions, there were three partitions. The Russian soldiers, they defeated Polish troops on their attack in Warsaw, and they defeated the Polish troops in the suburb called Praha, which is on the eastern banks of the Wisla River, Vistula in English. The Russian soldiers massacred 20,000 civilians in Praga. And I think that probably gives us some idea of the kind of brutality that Russia has been applying to Poland, not only to Poland, but to other states and peoples around its neighbors. In their struggle for freedom and liberty, many Poles became the revolutionaries and freedom fighters of the 1800s. And there were various attempts at regaining liberty, regaining freedom by Polish revolutionaries and freedom fighters through various uprisings, and these were brutally quelled. These revolutionaries and freedom fighters and other dissidents, they were deported to Siberia. And this happened throughout the 1800s. And then essentially after 123 years of partitions, Poland regained its independence on the 11th of November, 1918. I think it was on Wednesday, Poland celebrated 102 years of independence. Going forward to the Second World War, Soviet Russia invaded Poland on the 17th of September, 1939, and annexed half of Poland. Polish citizens were deported to Siberia, many of whom were children. So, right, what does Siberia mean to Poles? For Poles, Siberia is more than a geographical concept. Siberia is also a symbol of Russian repression, a symbol of Russian ethnic cleansing, and a symbol of Russian crimes against humanity. Now, whenever I come to the Holocaust Center here, I'm reminded vividly and painfully of the victims of the Holocaust through images, through films, and it helps convey the tragedy of the Holocaust, the pain, the suffering, and so on. Very few images and very few film footage is available from Siberia, what happened there. So alternative means have to be developed to be able to develop narratives. And here we find that second generationers are now starting to contribute towards developing their own family narratives. And these narratives then contribute towards developing Poland's stolen memories. Now, having said that, I'd like to end off on a positive note. Yes, Siberia may have tragic connotations, but I want to put forward the view that, on a positive note, Siberia can be used as a symbol of hope, a symbol of resilience, a symbol of remembrance, and most importantly, a symbol of tolerance and enlightenment. Okay, with that, having said that, let me introduce our first speaker. I just need to get my papers organized. I'm sitting in front of a huge open window, which is lovely on a lovely summer's day here in Johannesburg. Okay, now our first speaker is Antonia Czechowska Bifulco, who is a psychology professor and directs the Center for Abuse and Trauma Studies at Middlesex University in London. Antonia has researched extensively on the effects of childhood abuse and trauma on the longer-term mental health of people, and she has investigated childhood experience, adversity, and I think an important concept here. She's investigated attachment style intergenerationality. Attachment style intergenerationality. And she's also an advocate of intensive interview measures. Antonia's interests have recently extended to documenting her own Polish family history. And she published a book in 2017 entitled Identity, Attachment, Resilience, exploring 3 generations of a Polish family. And this book is published by Routledge in London and, well, is available on Amazon. Is available on Amazon's website. Now, Antonia's met various descendants of the Siberazi families, both in England and here in South Africa. Last year, Antonia was a guest speaker physically here in South Africa. It was fantastic to have her. And meeting these various descendants has generated an interest for her in this wartime trauma, its impacts, and the resulting integration with the new cultures. So once again, the title of Antonia's presentation is Lost and Found, The Search for Identity. Antonia, over to you.
Mute, yeah, thank you. I will, thank you for that fine introduction. I'll just try and share my screen. Okay, let me just get rid of these. Okay, Stefan, can you see that all right, the screen? Is that all? Okay, good. So thank you for that kind introduction, Stefan. I'm delighted to be here and thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but modern technology is extraordinary, isn't it, really? In meaning that I can be here at my home in West London and still join with all of you in South Africa and elsewhere. So the title, Lost and Found, Searching for Identity. And before I continue, just to thank everybody who's been involved in putting on this conference, including the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, and also the Polish Embassy there in Pretoria. I notice our PAN ambassador is with us, so that's great, and the universities involved, and especially to Stefan and Kobus for driving, being the driving forces behind these conferences. Oops, there we go. Okay, so because I'm a psychologist, I wanted to give a psychological approach to how we think about some of the impacts of the Siberian deportation on both the first generation and the second generation. And for me, this is through personal accounts. So listening to interviews and hearing what people, how people reflect on what happened to them is a really a vital source of information on what really happened to people. And another topic or aspect that's psychological is this idea of searching, which is something that comes from part of the mourning process, but is also the search for identity. And I'd like to touch on that in terms of the second generation particularly. And then once we have loss, then we have finding. So finding our families, our stories, ourselves. And one of the things is, for me, is making history personal, since I'm a psychologist and not a historian, I should say, so you'll have to forgive that aspect. And Stalin said, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. But I think we can say that the tragedy of historical events through stories and narratives means that a million deaths can be a million tragedies. And by bringing each story to light, we can get behind any statistics or any way of sort of hiding anything that happened through individual stories and have empathy with people over this. So the other thing to mention is that all cultures have rituals to aid with mourning, and this month in November we have All Saints' Day for visiting graves, and in Poland I know the 1st of November is very significant and people light candles on graves, and here in England we have Remembrance Days for soldiers lost in war on the 11th, so I think November is a good month to remember those lost. And what I'll talk about today is some quotes from different interviews. And these narratives are not ones I've generated. They're from two documents. The first one, In War and Peace, Collected Memories of Birmingham's Poles. And this is from the Midlands Polish Community Association. And they were sent to me by Dr. Maureen Smoikis, who is from Birmingham University. And I hope she is here with us today. And then the second and that's the first generation of Poles, so the memories of Poles who actually went through the Siberian deportation. And then the second document is Invisible Poles, which was put together by Professor Anne White and Dr. Kinga Goodwin at University College London, and that deals with second generation Poles and focuses on identity. These two documents aren't only about from Siberacji, but they're from different aspects of Polish identity and Polish stories. So, Stefan, thank you for actually outlining the historical facts. I don't think I need to spend time on that because you're all obviously familiar with it. But the point being that around 1.5 million Polish families from East Poland, also called the Kresy region, were deported to Siberia in February 1940. Of course, unexpected because the USSR had not declared war. And there were also Polish prisoners of war, and the Katyn massacre was also, in a way, part of this story. But that's a whole presentation in itself, so I won't go into that. But obviously, following amnesty, Sikorski and Anders intervened for families to be released in 1942, and this is when their long journey started. Around the globe, really, and some to fight with the Allies in Italy. So a quote from Mikhail, first generation, about how it started. On the 10th of February 1940, in the middle of the night, we heard a tremendous banging on the door. My father opened the door and an NKVD man entered with a gun and 7 Red Army people. They scattered around our house. They told us we had to go 110 miles distance. The family had to go by sledge to the railway station, 24 kilometers away. We were put in cattle trucks and the long journey to Siberia began. We were in the cattle truck for 22 days. The rail journey only finished when the track ran out at Kotlas in Siberia, 18 months in a camp in Siberia. And then after the amnesty, and it's Norman Davis who called it the Trail of Hope in his publication, again, Mikhail, several families had to chip in to rent a coach on the train. Their journey took them to Tashkent by boat to the Aral Sea, then to Engels in Uzbekistan. Father went to join Anders' army. 5-year-old brother Bolek died of typhus. The children were put in a Polish orphanage, then moved to Baghdad and brief reunion with their father. By the end of the war, the family was scattered. Mikhail in Palestine, the father in Egypt, the sister and younger brother in Mexico, and a sister and brother in Russia near Archangel. And that gives you an idea of the very extensive geographical dispersal of these families. And from Dominic, who's 2nd generation, he says, my grandfather went off to fight all over North Africa. He was in Palestine. He fought at Monte Cassino in Italy. Dreadfully traumatic experiences. He was the only man from his village in his regiment to survive. He was separated from my grandmother for 7 to 8 years because she meanwhile joined the convoy of refugees that passed through Uzbekistan, then into Persia. From there, she was sent onwards to Rhodesia, where she spent 5.5 years in a Polish women's refugee camp, working as a camp baker, and then came to the UK, where she spent another 2 years in Magul refugee camp before she eventually was reunited with my grandfather through the agency of the Red Cross. So if we're thinking about loss in relation to this wartime experience, what does this include? Well, obviously, there were many deaths. And this could be from starvation, from illness, from violence. There was obviously loss from, through combat in the Italian campaign, and also the Katyn executions. And then separations, some were temporary until after the war, but of course with no communication and with this huge geographic spread, people simply didn't know where their family members were. And there were permanent separations, so some families did not get back in touch, either until after the war or even ever. And then there was a loss of home because people were unable to go back, not only to their own house, their own dwelling, but parts of the area where they came from were no longer in Poland after the war. And there was all sorts of problems in getting back to these places. So if we think of examples of the losses from the first generation, we had terrible diseases. I had malaria and dysentery, and I nearly died. Nearly all the young children died. Very few of us survived, but my sister and I managed to. That was Danuta, and then Michalina. My mother, father, 2 brothers and sisters-in-law got ill. My father developed pneumonia with some complications, and he died 4 months later. And even losses following the amnesty, this in Uzbekistan. After all this, my mother started to get swollen from hunger. We were left helpless. We didn't know what to do. And then my mother died. I put her on the arbor, like I did with my sister before, and my mother died. And we were left without a roof over our heads. But she had found out there was an orphanage set up nearby. And at the last moment, she said, get the children over to that orphanage. So that was Stanisława. And after the war, my mother, my father, they died in Russia. 2 of my sisters also died in Russia. My other 2 sisters had left Russia and spent 5 years in India, Mieczyslav. So you can see the examples of these very terrible losses that occurred to this group. So how do we view this as psychologists? So John Bolby is a very well-known British psychiatrist who wrote about loss, sadness, and depression. And a quote from him: loss of a loved person is one of the most intensely painful experiences any human being can suffer. And not only is it painful to experience, but it's also painful to witness, if only because we are so impotent to help. To the bereaved, nothing but the return of the lost person can bring true comfort. There is a tendency to underestimate how intensely distressing and disabling loss usually is, and for how long the distress and often displacement commonly lasts. And again, in the middle of the trauma of war, sometimes the pain of a particular loss, bereavement, can be overlooked. And following, so Bolby and Murray Parks came up with 4 phases of grief. So the first one being shock and numbness. That's the immediate response most people have when there's a death. But then this is followed by yearning and searching, usually for the lost person, but also for reminders of that lost person. Then disorganization and despair when people realize that this is permanent forever. But then when things go well, reorganization and recovery. And this is when people develop new meaning in their lives and can be comfortable with memories of the lost person. But there is such a thing as unresolved or complex mourning. And this is when people get stuck in one of these phases and can't go through to the resolution at the end. And this, of course, can happen when the loss is particularly traumatic or where the circumstances around it are very difficult. So the tasks of mourning are to accept the reality of the loss, to experience the pain of grief, to adjust to an environment in which the person who has died is missing, but then to emotionally relocate the person and move on with life. And when mourning is unresolved, when this process isn't completed positively, then it can lead to some psychological disorder. So it can lead to depression, where there's sadness, emptiness, lack of hope, or it can lead to anxiety, where there's a fear of future loss, of being abandoned, or fear of other people. And it can, in some circumstances, lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. This is when there's a lack of safety and where there's a reliving of trauma, or even sometimes an amnesia for the trauma that surrounds the loss. And so if we can understand how some losses are traumatic rather than more normative types of losses and how they're resolved, if we think of loss in sort of normal life, which is timely and expected, and by that I mean loss of elderly people who are close to us, who they get to the stage where they are naturally aging and then dying, or without extended pain, or without violence or malevolence involved, and where there are family to witness and be with the person when they die and follow mourning ritual. This is how one could look at a normative type of loss. But in wartime, it can be sudden and it can be untimely. And by that, it can be to children and young people who would not be expected normally to die then. And it can involve pain and suffering. There can be violence and malevolent intent for those persecuted. Families may be unaware or certainly unprepared. And there's often no time for any cultural ritual. People will be buried where they fell, virtually. So this is what would make it not just loss, but traumatic loss. And for those who want to read more about this, Julia Samuel's written a very good book about trauma and grief responses. And she just points out some of the difference in response for those suffering trauma, which involves danger, and those suffering grief, which is loss. But of course, for the families we're thinking about, both would have been present, because they would have had trauma associated with the dangers involved in the deportation and the journeys and the terrible living conditions, as well as the many losses that occurred on the way. But these are just, she points out some of the differences. For instance, intrusive images could be frightening and horrific with ordinary trauma, but they might be sad and the person yearned for, where there's loss. The re-experiencing may be threatening, or it may be of the person's presence. So there are differences in how the mind deals with loss, which is grief, and trauma, which is danger. But of course, for the people we have in mind, both of these would have been present at the same time because of the very complex traumatic conditions. So another question is, can unresolved trauma or loss cross generations? And there's now been quite a few papers written about trauma being transmitted through various mechanisms, some biological, some psychological, some social. But this particular paper by Braga, which was written about the Holocaust, points out that they can be transmitted through families, through particular communication styles. So for instance, where communication is indirect, it can be catastrophic, about guilt and victimization, and also presentification of trauma experience. And what that means is that for people, some people who've gone through trauma, it's as though the trauma is always with them. So in families where this is the case, then how it's transmitted to children may be quite problematic. The other thing about the experience of trauma, it can lead to negative beliefs. So a terrifying worldview, fear of recognition, this is for people who've been persecuted, lack of rootedness and belonging, and obviously for people who've been dispersed to various different countries. And this is at least some of the way in which children of people who've had war trauma can feel some effects even at a distance. And this is a quote from Natalia from Second Generation. You don't know the secrets that a lot of these people kept. There's been research done on the children of Holocaust survivors. Surely there must be some on the children of people who survived the Stalinist regime. My grandparents died en route coming out of Siberia, and their daughter, my auntie, had to bury them where they fell. That's not a very pleasant thing to do for a person who is a teenager. That must be awful at whatever age you are. And thinking, where are you going to end up? Or are you going to end up anywhere? Where's your next meal going to be? And this reference to secrets is the fact that often the first generation would not talk in detail about what happened to them. And this is a comment from Dominic, Second Generation, about the shock he felt. Naturally, as a child, when you feel there are secrets in the background, things that can't be discussed, you become curious. My grandfather died when I was in my early 20s, and I re-established contact with my Polish grandmother and found out for the first time what had happened to them. That was a deeply traumatic experience. I suppose the experience of refugees, experiences in concentration camps, in the Gulag, is something I'd read about in history books and I was aware of in a peripheral way. But to discover that members of your very close family had endured this horrendous experience, I found that was one of the crucial formative events, I suppose, of my adult life, one that I struggled with. The shock of hearing about their experience is something that took me a long, long time to digest. So this is a response from the child of a person who'd gone through the Siberian deportations on hearing about what happened. And there can be links to later loss. And again, this is about transmitting across generations. And Eva talks about looking after her own mother who was dying in sort of current times. I was looking after my mum. She had osteoarthritis in her knees and she had problems in walking. She eventually was in a wheelchair. And that stemmed from an accident that she had in Siberia. She was crossing a frozen river in Siberia. The boat capsized and she was in frozen water for over an hour. She couldn't swim, she couldn't get out. She was clinging to the side of this little boat for over an hour. She recovered, but suffered with rheumatism during the whole of her life. And about looking after her mother. It was hard times. I don't know how I did that looking back. I was working full time and looking after her. My life really revolved around her all the time. It felt as though I was living the end of her life for her. Everything revolved around her. My life was in a bad way when she died. I didn't know what to do with myself. I lost my identity. I didn't know who I was. I had this huge, huge hole and huge gap in my life, and I didn't know how to fill it. I didn't marry and was left on my own, and it was tough. It just became obvious that I didn't know who I was. So here she's relating how she looked after her mother who died, but even then referring back to her mother's trauma experience. And something similar from Yola Malin, who's a cousin of my close friend Irena, and they're from a Siberian deportee family. And Yola has written a lot about loss. Reading about the history of Poland, I'm aghast at what Poland suffered, yet its people still remain so faithful to a loving God. I am making notes about their faith, the devastating hunger they suffered, and the gratitude for every morsel of life they were given, expressed through their celebratory songs. I'm suddenly feeling the merging of faith with fury. I tell myself to pass my personal grief over to the communal ocean of tears, the place where all our sorrows flow, where my parents cried over their dreadful losses in the Second World War, where my father grieved for his colleagues killed in the massacre of 20,000 Polish officers at Katyn, where my mother's tears were held for those left behind in the depths of Siberia. And Eva talks about recovering the story after the loss, when she looked after her mother who died. And she says, and then I had started having all these questions that I never asked before. For example, the Siberian experience, the African experience. Mum always used to say, when I was in Siberia, this, and when I was in Africa, that. And I'd heard these stories so many times before, I just took them for granted. I didn't understand properly what was being said. And then when she was gone, I was looking through some of her photographs from when she was in Africa. I found her passport when she was in Tehran, and all these questions came flooding in. What was she doing in Siberia? How many people were there in Siberia? Why Africa? How big was that camp in Africa? How many people were involved? What happened? Why? All these things were starting to fill up in my head. And searching for narrative, she goes on to say, I thought I need to find out more about my history because now I really don't know what happened. So in my spare time at work, in the lunch hour, I used to search the internet. And I found it very difficult because there were lots of websites in Polish about Kresy, about Polish World War II, and it took forever. The translations weren't brilliant at the time. Some sites didn't even have translations, and it was taking me forever. I needed to know more, and obviously there was nobody to ask. So I was searching and searching the internet, and eventually I found an English site, an English group with descendants, very similar to me, all over the world, all searching for the same sort of answers. And I joined this group and became very active with them. And this thing about searching, so searching for the lost person, but also searching for the narratives and the stories. And there are now various Facebook pages and other technological means where people can be in touch and link up. And the paper I referred to before by Braga talks about mechanisms of resilience, including visitation of sites which deal with issues of trauma, belonging to a group where other people have the same experience, but also defense of humanitarian values. And this is just some of the pages you can see from the Facebook, the Kresy families. And it amazes me how many people are posting every day, asking if people know of other people, if they recognize people in photographs, looking at documents, asking people to help translate documents from Polish or Russian. And this is a really very active thing going on in the UK, and I'm guessing in other countries too. And carrying on with something that Yola Malin has written in her book, Carry a Whisper, which is about loss and mourning. What I seek to achieve for my family is an argument for reclaiming my sister's place amongst our ancestors, creating a sense of peace and reconciliation between what they gave us and what she took away with her suicide. By my own transformative expression of my loss, I hope to add to this reconciliation. I want to tell you this story. And she has written about her family's Siberian experience. I finished constructing the family book, Faith, Hunger and Song. I am relieved of a certain duty towards our family and ancestors. I've done it. I presented it at a special family occasion, very moved by their expressions of surprise and delight. It was as if I was gently warmly touched on the shoulders by a line of ancestors, by Josefa, Jerzy and my mum. They were right behind me, a humbling sensation, as if I am their surprise. And here I am telling their story, a powerful story, each line, each photograph, as I touch it and tell it again and again, becoming more real, more precious. I feel a sort of angelic gratitude, a truly humbling sensation. And if we continue with this theme of resilience, because I think what Julia was showing there was how going through the story, she reached some sort of idea of restoration of loss. And one of the things that struck me very much from looking at stories of the first generation is the tremendous gratitude they expressed to the places they went to of safety, where they were taken in. And I think this is also a sign of resilience, where people are able to express gratitude and to look at positive aspects of their situation. So Jadwiga said, we were free to go. We were no longer kept prisoners. We couldn't go back to Poland, so we were taken to camps in Persia. We were very happy. We had schools, scouts and guides, and there was food and hospitals. And Mihalina, when we landed on the other side of the Caspian Sea, it was beautiful. Clean beaches, clear water. We were stripped of our clothes. They had to be burnt because of infestation. And then Genoveva, we went by ship across the Indian Ocean to Mombasa and then by train to Kampala in Uganda. It was unforgettable. We saw giraffes, antelope, beautiful birds, and even elephants. It was the most picturesque place on earth. There were about 2,000 Polish refugees living in African huts. So this is a positive message that came out of their experience. So thinking more about identity and identity of the second generation, and this is definition by Erik Erikson, psychologist. It's the conscious sense of self that we develop through social interaction, which is constantly changing due to new experiences and information we acquire in our daily interactions with others. So it's important to notice that our sense of identity changes as we grow. And so if we seek out new roles or new information or new stories or new relationships, then our identity can change with that. And so this is a quote about finding family. So if we're looking for identity, finding family is one of those elements. So from the second generation, Isa says, in 2000, my mother met her sisters for the first time. All the while she thought they were dead. In 2003, I realized my father's sister, my auntie, had a child, my cousin. I didn't realize she existed. She ended up in Australia. There's lots and lots of layers I'm trying to unravel to understand myself and my family and my background. People are still looking. With the Cressy Siberia organization, they're looking for their heritage, but some are still looking for each other, which is really sad, isn't it, that they don't know what happened. And then Adelaide said, my father never talked about his background, like many of them don't. He was very secretive. He told us his family in Poland were all gone. I went in 2016 for the first time and found he had a wife in Poland and a son, my half-brother. They were no longer alive, sadly, but my nephew is there. They are so happy that I found them. It's been wonderful to connect. I feel a strong connection. I feel a blood connection to them in Ukraine. And finding the language. A lot of the interviews with the second generation were about their experiences with the Polish language. So Aniela says, my mum, her formative years were spent in Kenya, but I think because of that loss that they feel, that they really hold on to their traditions and the language. It's very important to them. Adelaide said, I swear in Polish. I know a few words. At home, we mostly spoke Italian, so her mother was Italian and father Polish. When we were young, my brother had more Polish than I did. The school teacher from this small village school came to the house and said that it's completely unacceptable that we should have all these languages and we were to speak exclusively English. Barbara said, I suppose I'm more relaxed speaking Polish. Mine was fossilized pre-war Polish, and then it took on some English phrases. And since the current Polish people have come, I've learned some current Polish and their phraseology. My cousin said, the problem with your Polish when you speak is you sound like a university professor. You don't speak the street language. But most were speaking Polish or learning Polish. And I like that diagram of the Polish grammar for beginners. It's really not easy. And another thing about identity is finding home and some sort of closure. So again, from the second generation, Aniela said, on their first visit to Poland in 1974, Mum and Dad desperately wanted to see all of it, and they took them to the places they were born in Ukraine. So they went to see the places where they would have grown up in. Mum was desperately wanting to see that. I think she had to do that. It's a form of closure almost. She's been to see her birthplace. They have no documents, no birth certificates or anything. And then Adelaide said, Poland was a place of danger. My father created it as a place of danger, and I was afraid of it. I didn't get to Poland until 2006. I went to Warsaw and Krakow. What a wonderful place. I was amazed at how young the population was because I only knew old Polish people. And I found this quote last week that I thought was rather appropriate. We leave something ourselves behind when we leave a place. We stay there even though we go away. And there are things in us that we can find again only by going back there, to go to ourselves, travel to ourselves. And another word that came up in some of the interviews was that of atonement. And this is the action of making amends for a wrong or injury. And Natalia, second generation, said, when you see Syria and the atrocities now, you think that could be my parents, that could be my family. And the idea that some of the places there's fighting now, they're actually the places where they were given succor. They were looked after. The Kazakh women were seen as wonderful. My dad went through Persia, Iran, but the war is still there and people still living in horrific circumstances. I suppose that's the humanitarian aspect of me wanting to know more, and of course somehow atone for what my parents went through. And then again, identity, about feeling Polish, a slightly odd Polish person, but richer. So Susanna said, I think I felt more Polish than British in Poland, but I feel a slightly odd Polish person. I feel it's part of me to be Polish, and I probably feel more Polish over there. And then Janina, it was nice to go to Poland, but I kind of feel I'm in between. My friends would make fun of me and say I spoke like an older woman. I'd be more formal. I thought about going to live in Poland, but my language wouldn't be good enough. I think it would be too, you know, I'm not Polish. And then Aniela, I can say hand on heart that I feel like a native in Poland. I'm actually applying for Polish citizenship. That's how strongly I feel about it. I'm mature enough to understand what my parents went through, grandparents went through, and they have left me a really lovely legacy. There's such a lot of lovely culture in the country that we were brought up with. It's made me a richer person. Again, some comments on the second generation and feeling Polish. So Eva says, here in Manchester, they are what usually English people call the old Poles and the young Poles, but they don't see the middle. They don't see people like me who are born here. They can't get their heads around the fact that all these Poles ended up in England and settled and had families here. I'm not really a Pole because I'm English. And Mike says, a few here feel more Polish than the Polish because they were over here as part of the mission of exile. The new Poles had little time really for the existing Polish organizations. The feeling in our parents' generation is that some of the new Poles were not quite as patriotic. And then Agnieszka, I've been terribly proud of being Polish, not only because what they have gone through, but because of the culture, the history, what they've achieved, you know, and just the people themselves. The whole world recognizes the strength of character of the Poles, which is great. And what I've realized is how much there is available on the topic of the Siberazi. So obviously Norman Davis's book, which was a classic really, and not just as a history book, but with lots and lots of personal accounts and photographs in it as well. It's really very accessible. But then I found the book on Poles in India, and then the two films about Poles in Africa, Memory is Our Homeland. No, sorry, one film about Africa, which is Memory is Our Homeland by Jonathan Durand. And then there's one you can see on the internet about New Zealand, the story of Polish orphans in New Zealand. So there's a tremendous amount out there, and the Faith, Hunger and Song, which is the Yola Malin book about the African group. So finding the narratives, I think, is one of the things that encourages resilience. Things like the Siberazi and Cressy organizations, and this conference itself is a fantastic way of highlighting all these stories and experiences. There are many publications about family stories, even PhDs, Stefan, and then interview collections, videos, film and exhibitions. And I think there's a great deal of resilience in the families and in later generations. The narratives tell of gratitude and positive feelings to their place of safety. Later generations find great respect for their parents' and grandparents' survival and sacrifice. And I think the importance of family, faith, friendship, and the future have been retained. And there are different ways of remembering and increasing identity. You've probably all know the memorial in Warsaw, first picture there of the Siberian deportations. The second image I've taken from the stained glass window at Uterstorm for the African, the orphans who settled in South Africa. My own sister has written a novel, 2 novels in fact, about Poles living in England, in Derby, and my own book about exploring Polish generations. So we're really part of a whole large group who wants to disseminate these stories to a wider population. And for me, it's been very personally enriching, having explored my own Polish background. So exploring and writing about the family history, refinding family in Poland. So although we were in touch, we've reinforced those contacts and had family gatherings, and my sisters and I have been to weddings and funerals and etc. 90th birthday parties, all in Poland, and been very welcomed. I've got my Polish citizenship, so now makes me a European, and there's whole doubts about the UK being European. Coming over to South Africa to visit, initially to visit Polish family, but then to find the Siberian group, which has led to a whole lot of really interesting interactions. Teaching in Warsaw, so here I am with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jadwiga Królikowska, and we are now doing collaborative work together, connecting with new Polish friends in London. So here with my friend Irena, she and her husband Kazik, when we went to Warsaw together, and relearning the language, which I can assure you will take many, many years, but the intent is there. So what are the messages about family history? It illuminates our sense of identity, who we are and where we come from. It provides empathy and understanding with previous generations. It honors our parents and gives previous generations a voice. It can make us aware that conflict in history should not be repeated, and it connects us across continents. And just a note to remember, refugees are mothers, fathers and sisters, brothers, children with the same hopes and ambitions as us, except that a twist of fate has bound their lives to a global refugee crisis on an unprecedented scale. So thank you very much for your attention.
Antonia, thank you very much for your presentation. And as was mentioned earlier on by Ndu, we'll have questions and answers after all the presentations. Now, before we go on to our second speaker, Dr. Julia Devlin, we're going to have a bit of an interruption with a brief chat with Dr. Kobus Rademeyer, who I hope he's online. I don't quite see him.
Yes, he's there.
He's there, okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, oh, there you are, okay. All right. Kobus, you just need to, okay, I'll introduce you first. All right, Dr. Kobus Rademeyer, he's from the Sol Plaatje University. It's a new university in South Africa, and it's based in Kimberley in South Africa. And he's head of the social sciences department, and he's also a senior lecturer in history. Antonia referenced my PhD. I should add that I'm trying to tackle a PhD, and Kobus is my primary supervisor. I'm hoping after this conference I can sort of like get stuck into it. Now, this conference, the series of conferences, the South Africa Poland History Conferences, they basically form one of the themes within the South Africa within the South Africa-Poland History Project. And Cobus will say a few words about the South Africa-Poland History Project and hopefully give you a better sense of idea of what we do here in South Africa within this project. Cobus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and good afternoon, everybody. Just before we came online today, I had a discussion with Tali, and we were saying it's almost becoming a custom that we must have a massive rainstorm on this Sunday of this conference. Now, I've heard everybody been saying it's sunny in Johannesburg. In Kimberley, it's been raining for the last 2 hours. So for those of you who don't know Kimberley, it's in the western part of South Africa. It's an arid area, and we don't get rain often. So I'm sure we are blessed by this conference today for the rain. So if you're battling to hear me, I've put it on full blast, but it is still raining quite hard. So please, apologies for the sound if it's not that good. But I'm gonna be very brief. I just want to give you a bit of a background on the South African Polish history project that we've been running. Many of you have heard this before, and I'm just going to expand a bit on it. Basically, this project has been running now since 2013. It's a very long story how Stefan and I eventually met up, but initially it was basically a linkage between the Polish Association of Siberian Deportees in Africa and the history department at the Kwakwa campus of Free State University, which have just started at that stage in 2013. So when I moved to Solplaik University in 2015, this was one of the very first projects that was registered as a research project at this new university. And Solplaik University is only 7 years old at this stage as well. So the project and the university that I work for now is more or less the same age. I can't say that it was a slow start, because it started with a bang. Once Stefan and I met and we started talking to more people and we started drawing in more people, it really took off at some pace. And first of all, I think we're very grateful for the support we get from the Polish embassy in South Africa. They've been a tremendous support in this instance. And then the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center came aboard, and along the line we just started getting more and more support, and we were getting more and more partners in the project. We've started looking at partnerships outside South Africa in Eastern Europe, and we were hoping for 2020 to be a big year in this instance, but I think you've heard it so many times, and I think we all feel the same. 2020 has just put a brake on absolutely everything. But like Stefan was saying just now about the positive message from Siberia as well, I think a positive message from 2020 is also it gave us a bit of time to sit back and to reflect and to take stock of where we are and where we want to be. So behind the scenes, there has been a couple of discussions and negotiations that's been going on. But strangely enough, at my university, and given the fact that it's a young university, and even our server and our systems that we are using is still very young and untested, we've had 2 scares with Zoom and 3 with MS Teams, where we could not even communicate externally. So we were hoping to be a bit further in our negotiations, but at this stage, thanks to Zoom and MS Teams, there's a couple of very fruitful ideas that's coming forth for partnerships and collaboration going forward, which hopefully will in 2021 come to the fore. As Stefan is saying, we've been this is the 7th conference that we've been running, and every year this time I start thinking back at the previous conferences, and it's just every year has been a great success, but every year it's also growing and growing, and this was a first for us as well, taking it online. And every year we get these brilliant people to share ideas with us, and I think this year is no different. And thank you very much in this instance to the two brilliant minds that we have discussing with us today their ideas. I also think, as other parts of the conference, of the project, as I said, I don't want to keep you too long. The idea of the Polish orphans of Oudtshoorn is not well known, and that is why once we are done with the conference, Stefan will. Unfortunately, I have to be harsh with him afterwards, and we'll have to start looking at his PhD. The whole issue of the Polish orphans have been discussed on 3 different conferences, 2 in Poland and one at a historical association of South Africa conference in Stellenbosch. And after every presentation, people will say, wow, this is fascinating. We need to know more about this. And I think that is the biggest thing behind the project, is to start expanding into a way of which we can put the story out there, not only the story, but also the legacy. So we are growing as a group. We started off with only 3, and then Marta Nowakovska came in, and we were 3, and we keep on expanding. And I think the positive of this is wherever we go, or if we speak to new people, there's new contacts that we build, and hopefully the group will keep on expanding. And we're looking forward to a very productive 2021, whereby hopefully at the conference next year, we will not only be telling you about what the project is all about, but I think more importantly next year to tell you what happened in 2021, because there's really a couple of very big potential collaborations and partnerships that's on the horizon, and hopefully we can give a full detailed feedback on that in 2021. Stefan, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Cobus, thank you very much for that. In fact, I'm still in awe of how this the South Africa Poland History Project has just exploded. Literally, it's it's just I think it was almost like meant to happen that you came along and Marta came along, and here we are 7 conferences later. All right, okay, now on to our next speaker. It's Dr. Julia Devlin. Dr. Julia Devlin is the executive director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Flight and Migration at the Catholic University, Eichstaett-Ingolstadt in Germany. Julia is a historian with a focus on voluntary and forced migration, with a particular interest in transgenerational transmission of trauma and the relevance of memory in diasporic communities. Julia has studied Eastern European history, modern history, history of art, and Slavistics at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in London, and at the Moscow Linguistic University Moscow, and at Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich, where she earned her PhD in 2002. Julia has taught a wide range of graduate courses at Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich and at the Catholic University of Eichstätt, including aspects of cultural and architectural history and memory studies. Julia is also involved in programs for refugee education, and she is a regular author with Bayerischer Rundfunk. Now, how I came across Julia is that in April of this year, Julia published a paper entitled In Search of the Missing Narrative, Children of Polish Deportees in Great Britain. I read this paper and it resonated with me, particularly myself being a child of a deportee. And I made contact with Julia, and she graciously accepted to present a paper today, which is in fact titled after this paper, In Search of the Missing Narrative, Children of Polish Deportees in Great Britain. Julia, over to you. I saw Julia just now. Oh, she's starting to share her screen.
Julia, you are muted. You'll have to unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Second attempt. Okay, sorry, doesn't seem to work.
We do see it. We
You
do
can-
see it. Yes.
Okay.
Try again.
Doesn't seem to. Oh, bear with me. Just a moment. Jörg? Irgendwie es funktioniert nicht. Kannst du mal bitte kommen?
Julia, we can see your screen. I think it's just a question of starting.
I can see you. Okay, can you still see my screen?
No, now you need to start sharing again. We did see it before.
Ich habe jetzt das angeklickt. Thanks for bearing with me. And thank you, Stefan, for inviting me to this exciting conference. I'm greatly flattered to be here and present a paper on the topic of my article, which I published in April, as Stefan told you. Yes, it's titled In Search of the Missing Narrative. Forced migration is a trauma that can have enduring effects, not only for the victimized, but for the next generations as well. In my talk, I will examine how second-generation Poles in Great Britain, whose parents had been deported from Soviet-occupied Poland during World War II, relate to their family narrative. A frequent issue amongst the children of deportation survivors is that they do not know about their parents' past, as the parents would not talk about the deportation, and they feel excluded from this part of the family experience, especially as they sense the echoes of it. Drawing upon Aleida and Jan Assmann's concept of communicative and cultural memory, as well as the findings of narrative research, I address the feelings of exclusion experienced by the children of deportees and argue that they are caused by their parents' difficulties to verbalize a traumatic past. I don't know anything about my father's past, or I wish I would have known what he had gone through. These are the sort of remarks frequently made when children of deportation survivors talk about their parents. They had to cope with their parents' emotional distance, inexplicable behavior, and taboo family secrets. Often the deportees, many of whom had been soldiers in World War II, were traumatized, showed symptoms of shell shock, or had anxiety disorders. Moreover, the deportees had to struggle with all the hardships of first-generation migrants, such as a new language, a new culture, and social decline, as their qualifications might not be acknowledged. But they would only rarely verbalize the hardships they had endured. The ongoing effect of trauma has been extensively described in the case of the Holocaust. The phenomenon of survivors not being able to speak about the past, thus causing a vicarious trauma in their children, has been described by Helen Epstein. Epstein reported how she and other children of Holocaust survivors were possessed by a history they had never lived. Ellen S. Fine, who is a philologist, coined the term absent memory for this phenomenon. I quote, "Afflicted by the unhealed wounds of memory, those born in the aftermath of genocide continue to bear its burden. They have inherited the anguish, yet at the same time feel excluded from a universe they can never know," unquote. A similar phenomenon can be observed with the children of deportation survivors, a persistent effort of the second generation to come to terms with their parents' past, a feeling of exclusion caused by the interrupted intergenerational communication, as there were no narratives about the past. Narratives are not only a mere account of events, they are an active means of making sense of what happened, to impose meaning on personal experiences. I quote from Rosenwald and Ockberg, "Personal stories are not merely a way of telling someone or oneself about one's life. They are the means by which identities may be fashioned. It is this formative and sometimes deformative power of life stories that makes them important." Narratives play an important role not only in individuals' lives, but also for group identities. They provide a framework that is important, especially for children and adolescents, while they are in the process of developing a sense of self. In a study by Bohanek et al. About family narrative interactions, the authors state, "Narratives provide understanding, evaluation, and perspective on the events of our lives. Through narrative interactions about the shared past, parents help shape children's understanding of who they were, who they are now, and presumably who they will be in the future, both as individuals and as members of the family. Thus, although family communication and interaction in other contexts and settings is clearly important, the role of family narratives may be particularly critical for children's developing sense of self." Studies point to the positive effect of this framework. In families where many family stories are told and where, as a consequence, adolescent children know a lot about their family history, the offspring displays, I quote, "higher self-esteem and lower levels of internalizing, for example, anxiety, depression, and externalizing, like aggression, acting out, behavior problems." Narratives are a means of communicative memory, a variety of collective memory. In the 1920s, the French sociologist Maurice Alvax developed the theory of collective memory. He pointed to the central role of memory for the construction of group identity. Alvax referred to the formative structure of memories shared between certain groups as members of a family, religious groups, or nations. This graphic shows how collective memory is the intersection of personal memories. Taking Alvax's pioneering work further, Aleida Assmann and Jan Assmann distinguish between communicative and cultural memory. Communicative memory is characterized by its informality, by its everyday practice. It refers to memories that are shared between smaller social groups, like families or football clubs or work teams. And they are based on personal, mostly oral interaction. Communicative memory spans 3, at most 4 generations. Cultural memory, on the other hand, is more durable. It is defined as the sum of cultural narratives about the past, including both knowledge about and judgment of history that are potentially available to the average citizen. Its media is material, visible and tangible, like monuments, buildings, rituals, images, memorials, or anniversaries. They are all media of cultural memory. In practice, both forms are interconnected. Forced migration has a disruptive effect on communicative memory. If migration happened voluntarily, family narratives frequently relate to the country of origin, the decision to emigrate, and the process of separation and relocation. But the workings of memory are sporadic, fractured, and enervated under the impact of trauma. And thus there are fewer narratives in the context of forced migration. Part of the trauma is the experience of passive victimhood, whereas the memory of active victimhood can be turned into a meaningful heroic sacrifice, like with martyrdom or with the Résistance in France. The powerlessness of passive victimhood, the impossibility to fight or resist, can only with difficulty become integrated into a positive self-image. Trauma can have a long-lasting impact. Often the trauma is reenacted in the psyche of survivors, continuing to stir unrest even decades after the original event. Aleida Assmann, Unraveling How Memory Works, explains the effect of trauma on the process of remembering by pointing to the defense mechanism which psychiatrists call dissociation. It is an unconscious strategy of holding a threatening experience at a distance or cutting it off from the victim's conscious mind, although the event is certainly registered. Traumatizing experiences thus live on in a latent state, but can cause long-term disturbances in the victim's personal development and can be passed on to the next generation. To interrupt the intergenerational passing of trauma, it is necessary that the segments of the trauma that are unconscious or cut off from the conscious mind are successfully converted into a conscious form. But to achieve this end, not only individual therapeutic counseling is needed, it is also necessary to have a social and political environment that provides a framework where the remembrance of traumatizing events can find a place in social memory. With this research, I extend a scholarship on the formation of communicative and cultural memory and on family narratives from the victims of the 1940-41 deportations from the Polish Kresy borderlands. Well, the historical backgrounds are well known in this group, I'm sure. Following the German and Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, both regimes began a reign of terror. In the eastern part, the Soviet area of occupation, the Soviets imprisoned and deported large numbers of Polish nationals in their pursuit of eradicating all traces of the Second Polish Republic and of Polish culture. They aimed especially at the clergy, military, civic officials, and academics and their families. The first wave of mass deportation of civilians took place in February 1940, and the fourth and last in June 1941. People were woken at night. They were carried to the next railway station and taken by cattle cars to the interior of the Soviet Union. Most of them had to work in forced labor camps or had to fend for themselves. Alliances changed with the German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. The Soviet Union now became an ally of Great Britain and the United States. Diplomatic relations were re-established between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet Union. With the Sikorski-Maisky Agreement, both governments agreed to military alliance and the deported Poles were released from the labor camps. To enhance the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany, more than 70,000 Polish men and women fit for warfare were brought to Iran and from there to the battlefields of Europe, while 34,000 civilians, women, children, and men unfit for fighting were brought to refugee camps in Africa and India. When the war ended, the Polish soldiers were demobilized and the refugee camps were dissolved. Many Poles emigrated to Great Britain, the United States, or Canada. Only a few returned to Poland. The Poles who had stayed behind in the Soviet Union were repatriated after the war. Many emigrated further as their pre-war homeland had ceased to exist. The Polish Kresy borderlands having been incorporated into the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian Soviet republics. In my research, I investigate how the experience of forced migration, prison camps, the death of loved ones, and uprootedness affects the next generation. I focus especially on how children of survivors perceive their parents' communication about these traumatic experiences. I conducted in-depth interviews with children of deportation survivors and drew additional information from unpublished archival documents and published autobiographical records. Quite typical is Isa's remark about her father. I knew something obviously had gone wrong, but you also don't know how to say things because how do you say, Dad, well, tell us more about it if it's going to upset him. But also when you're younger, you don't know if you want to hear. And sometimes I wanted to ask him something else, but then he would get upset and then I would start crying because I had made him upset. So he stopped. So he never actually sat down and said, this is it, I'm going to tell you. I just pieced it all together from every single thing over years. This particular person's relationship with her father was friendly and respectful, so she would stop asking questions out of tact, as she felt it was too painful for her father to be reminded of what she called the war. In contrast, Another lady told me she had a strained relationship with her mother. She was born to Polish parents in England in the 1960s. Her mother was deported to Siberia when she was a small child, where she and her younger sister, her mother and her younger sister succumbed to tuberculosis. As an orphan, she was brought up by whoever was there. When talking about the past, this particular person often used phrases like, "I think," or "I am not sure," and her statements contained a lot of guesswork. She seemed astonished at how little she knew about her mother's life. Apart from snippets, there was only one story that seemed to be complete, meaning that it conformed to narrative. Apparently, questions had been asked about the mother's life in Siberia, but her mother would deny having any memories. I quote, she said not, but I find that hard to believe because I remember things when I was that, well, maybe she didn't remember things from 3, 4, 5 years old, but I certainly remember lots of things from when I was 7 and 8 and 9. So I never really, she was very dismissive of it. She would always say that she didn't remember. And she said that there's nothing to tell. There was nothing there. There was nothing there but wolves and snow. That's all she would say. The mother's silence was perceived as an active refusal of sharing parts of her history. But even when the relationship between family members was harmonious, there was a sense of feeling excluded because receiving information happened only in a coincidental way. Aga, another lady whose name I have changed, told me about tiny glimpses of her parents' life in Siberia. For example, the long, terrible train ride in the cattle car. I quote, "If they died at night, the bodies weren't removed until the morning. And also the whole cart with the soldier, with the gun, as you relieved yourself, the hole in the bottom of the train. They talked about that. That's all I know about the journey. Those 2 years in Siberia, and I only know a few words really of what happened." Other snippets were meant to have an educational character. These come closer to an actual narrative. For example, there were stories relating to the scarcity of food. Aga's parents had told her that her father had killed the camp commandant's dog to feed the meat to her starving mother. And there was a story about a dead horse. I quote, "In that particular camp, people were really starving, and then a horse had died. And it had been buried, and 3 days later, they dug it up and ate it. I mean, and the NKVD were actively, they would have shot, they would have whatever. And like my father, if they found he'd done the dog or the other people who were eating this dead horse. So we knew about the dog and the horse because when we were children, we wouldn't eat. They would say, in Siberia, you'd even eat a dog or a horse, even if the horse had died and been dead for 3 days. So we knew about that. This behavior of not telling about the past is mostly attributed to the fact that, as survivors and immigrants, they had to have a forward-looking attitude. They were survivors. Survivors don't live in past, said Aga. It is striking how the second generation looks for information about their parents and other members of the family who were deported. The urge to piece the puzzle together makes them spend a significant time researching in books and internet forums and on journeys to the original sites. Deportation lists are browsed for familiar names and searching goes on in social media. Ellen Fine, analyzing literary accounts by children of Holocaust survivors, stated that the second generation had an urge to fill a void that was created by the trauma suffered by their parents. I quote, "They are haunted by the world that has vanished. A large gap exists in their history, and they desire to bridge this gap, to be informed about what occurred, to know something about members of their family who perished." Searching for information is a form of constructing not only an individual memory, but also a collective memory. As Assmann states, to overcome trauma, it is necessary that there is a supportive social and political environment allowing traumatizing events to be embedded in social memory. Peter Leucis, who is an anthropologist doing research on the trauma of Armenian deportation, and his findings point in the same direction. He speaks of the half-lives of deportation and says they depended on how memories of past wrongs and emergent identities were managed, both by the groups themselves and by the political influences to which they were exposed. A supportive environment is crucial to overcoming trauma. This points to both communicative and collective memory. Initially, neither could thrive in the case of the deported Poles. Traumatized parents kept silent about the past, and their children, dependent on their parents' communicative skills for their identity development, only sensed the reverberation of traumatizing events. The development of a collective memory was hampered as well. The recognition of loss and suffering was not awarded. The homeland of the deported Poles, the Eastern Polish Sea, was ceded to the Soviet Union with the Yalta Agreement. Immediately after the war, most countries withdrew their recognition of the government of the Second Polish Republic in exile, the legitimate representatives of pre-war Poland. The deportations were hushed up. The participation of Polish troops and their sacrifices in the war against Nazi Germany were not acknowledged. This became painfully apparent when Polish forces were not allowed to join in the 1946 London victory celebrations because the British government did not want to confront Stalin. It was a grave injustice, considering the Poles were the fourth largest national group in the Allied war effort. This is a grievance that is brought up frequently with children of survivors and is one of the biggest issues of feeling excluded in a new host society. According to Assmann, rituals and celebrations are a medium of cultural memory. Not allowing the Polish ex-combatants to march in a parade celebrating a victory they had helped to achieve is an act of exclusion. So, in the immediate post-war years, it was difficult to form a collective memory. For the second generation, this meant a gap in their identity construction. This explains the ongoing search for information. It is an attempt to fill the void, to regain control of the traumatic events their parents had gone through, and thus convey a sense of agency. Towards the end of my presentation, I want to treat you to a little film. During my research process, I met Carola, whose mother had been deported. Carola is a writer and a comedian, and the topic of a mother's ordeal features frequently in her work. I would like to show you Carola's little animated film, Siberian Carrots, as a quite unique way of putting a search for a missing narrative into art.
My mother told me this story about when she was sick.
Julia, there is no sound.
Food.
Oh, sorry.
My mother said that all...
Sorry, shall I start again?
Yes, please.
Is it working?
Yes.
My mother told me this story about when she was 6 and she was in Siberia during the war with her mother and her older brother Henyek. Stalin had them taken out there when the Russians invaded Poland. It was freezing and there was very little food. My mother said that all she ate for the 6 years she was there was black bread, sunflower seeds and weeds. One day she and some friends walked past a field of carrots and decided to steal some. After they had had their fill, they left, but my mother said she turned back to get some carrots for her brother Henyek, who was at school. She said she took 4 carrots and hid them under her armpits as she walked home. When she got home, she placed the carrots under Henyek's pillow. That evening, my mother's mother saw him eating the carrots and asked him where he'd got them from. He said, "I found them under my pillow." My mother owned up to having stolen them and thought she was going to be beaten. But instead, her mother took her by the shoulders and knelt in front of her, saying, "Don't ever do that again. Because if you do and you get caught, I'll get put into jail and that'll be the end of you." My mother said she never stole anything ever again.
Okay, Carola, by the way, is the author of a wonderful book, Are My Roots Showing? I have recommended it to Antonia already. It's here, I can highly recommend it. It's a lovely book. As a conclusion, I would like to say, forced migrations are taking place all over the world, caused by persecution, war, or climate disaster. My findings stress the importance of creating a supportive environment for migrants and refugees so that a communicative and a cultural memory referring to the migratory experience can be formed. Cultural and memory institutions such as museums, libraries, schools, and universities can play an active role in recognizing and representing traumatizing events. Providing a framework for the cultural memory of uprooted people would be a true act of inclusion, and it would further interfamilial communication, thus supporting an act of healing, as the cycle of silence between generations might be broken. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. Beyond superb, that's all I can say for myself. All right, I think it's now time for question and answer, and I think I'm going to be helped here by Mdu. I have not been following the questions or the chats, but I'm not too sure if there are any. Mdu?
Yes, so we do have a question from Mon van der Berg, who's asking, let me just get to the question. It's a very interesting show. She says, in one of the British paid videos, the narrator stated that people walked 3,000 miles to reach Siberia. How far did they walk in a day then to walk that far?
Can I respond to that? Okay, that British Pathé newsreel, it's based on films that was taken in Oudtshoorn. And unfortunately, it's a propaganda movie. I would ignore the beginning part and the end part because it doesn't portray the correct history, because the map, if I recall, doesn't actually show the Poles being deported into Siberia. And in fact, it just shows them walking, and the narrator says they've walked out of Siberia 3,000 miles. But as I said, I think it's a lot of it is propaganda. I did show that movie to some of the Siberian deportees, who were in Oudtshoorn, and I thought they would be interested, but I was surprised at how agitated they were, especially since it is a propaganda movie, because once again, it didn't quite tell the full story about the Poles going into Siberia and out, purely not to offend Stalin. I myself, I've seen that video, and I've often seen the video clips in other similar British Pathé newsreels, and whether the Poles actually walked 3,000 miles, I have to question that, because I been trying to follow my parents, both the mother and father, their journeys out of Siberia, and a lot of it was on the trains coming out of Siberia. So I would question the accuracy of whether the Poles actually did walk the 3,000 miles. Yeah, that would be my response to that.
Antonia, Julia, oh, there's no response.
Okay. Antonia has to unmute herself.
Yeah, I don't know that the stories I've heard about how they got to Siberia was in these cattle trucks or trains. So I don't know. I haven't heard stories of walking, although, I'm afraid I'm not expert on that.
Yeah.
Well, it was partly organized, partly self-organized, because the Polish government in exile, which was caring for the soldiers after they were, well, after the so-called amnesty. They organized that. So the Polish government in exile sent missionaries to Siberia or to Kazakhstan and told the people you can go to certain places, and then trucks or train rides were organized. Not for everyone, it was rather chaotic, as you can presume in the circumstances, but they did not all walk. You have testimonies about people being on ships, for example, and other being on army carts. But the Polish government in exile and the other allies, of course, had an interest in getting as many soldiers into the Polish army, so they wouldn't just have them walking. They were transported partially. Yeah, rafts on rivers, as in the chat has just been said. Yeah.
All right. And then we have another question from Tali, who says, can you discuss the differences between the survivors that spoke and those that kept silence? I know it from Holocaust survivors and wonder about research on Siberian deportees.
Well, I can talk from experience if it's just to get the discussion going, if it would help. Taking to, let's say, second generation, pure second generations here in South Africa, there were a few deportees who spoke openly about their experiences. Both my parents, I learned from a very early age not to ask questions. And I just lived with it. You know, the fact that I think I'm Polish.
Stefan, your sound
is off. It's only in the year 2000. That's when I decided, okay, I need to start.
Maybe try to feel. Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you.
Oh, where should I start again, or where? I'm not too sure where you lost me.
Yes, yeah, towards the beginning.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, just to start again, having grown up with a number of these Siberian deportees, and mainly from Oudtshoorn, and then also having grown up with second generation as peers, there were a few deportees who spoke openly about their deportations. Most of the parents opted to be quiet, like my parents. Both my mother and father did not say anything. And in fact, I learned from a very early age not to ask questions. And in fact, this is almost like a weird experience, because in the year 2000, I decided, and I think the internet was becoming more and more widely accessible. And I remember Bettina, my wife, she allowed me to spend 3 months every single night searching the web, see what's coming out and what's happening, and almost get the impression that an international switch was flicked, where second generations were also out there looking and looking. And I think one of the first people to actually do something and collate everything was Stefan Visnowski, who's currently based in Sydney, Australia, and he essentially started he's the founder and president of the Crisis Siberia group, and it's in fact there's a huge amount of information that can be found on the Crisis Siberia discussion group. There's even a virtual museum. Yeah, so I think there's mixed views on whether parents spoke about things or didn't speak about things, but I fell in the category of not to ask questions, and when I did ask questions, fortunately my father was still alive and I was able to ask a number of questions. My mother passed away in 1982, so on my mother's side of the family there's a huge gap, but on my father's side I'm sort of like quite content that I have quite a solid knowledge base. So hopefully that can get the discussion going.
Antonia, would you like to add something?
Yes, well, thank you for that, Stefan. I think it's one of the impacts of trauma that people find it difficult to speak of it. And this goes to other traumas, not just war trauma, but of course war trauma has got the highest association with PTSD, and it's the most complex in terms of the number of traumatic experiences over a number of years. But it's common, I think, for people from various different types of war trauma not to speak of their experience. From what I know from my own childhood, my mother was English, and she would ask all the Poles in our community about their experiences, and they would tell her. But it would be I think it would be a very factual, rather a brief account. We were in Siberia, we did this, we did that. Not an emotional or a very in-depth description. And this is because trauma experiences can actually be locked in the brain where they can't readily be accessed, and it takes an amount of therapy, and people need to feel extremely safe when that's happening in order to process that well. So in an odd way, I think it's the task of the second generation to tell the stories for them, because I don't think they were able to, and I'm not sure many of them felt safe enough to do that anyway. Even if they could have, that they didn't, there were, remember during the Cold War, etc., there were many other fears as well. And this thing of it not being recognized or validated nationally meant that they probably thought they shouldn't talk also. Julia, I don't know if you have some comments on that.
Yeah, I would like to add, it's always like a challenge for the historian to find what isn't there, because of course the people I talk to and from which then I get my conclusions are the people who are willing to talk. I don't get the silent people because they are not answering, or they don't want to tell about, or in the second generation you had some cases which I found in the internet that people said, yeah, I never found out, only when my father was dead. So kind of, but that's always like with history. You can only kind of conclude something from where there is some talk. So it would be fascinating to find out what is if the children whose parents hadn't talked at all, but you wouldn't get their testimonies because, well, they didn't talk or they didn't write it down, because the act of writing down is quite similar, maybe even more painful than writing. And what you told about your mother as an outsider in these groups, getting information, that is quite interesting, because as you said, it was a formal kind of narrative. It was not like a moralic narrative, as I try to confer from what the narrative research is doing. Kind of, you have like a little moralic tale, but it was factual. It was like I was in cattle cars and we've been there 2 years or something. Yeah, well, it's difficult. It's difficult to find out, absolutely. And probably it has to filter, kind of percolate down, as you said, Antonia, to the second, maybe even to the third generation to find a voice.
Yes, thanks, Julia. And just to talk a little bit more about an outsider finding the stories. So there was one story of a Siberian deportee in Derby where we lived, and she talked about losing a child on the train platform. The child got left behind. So they all went off and the child was left behind. So she told this quite factually. And my mother burst into tears. So, it's where you don't get the congruence of emotion. So my mother, who was simply an observer, was upset. But the one who said it without emotion, although obviously it was highly traumatic and not unusual, actually.
All right, and then we have another question. Well, there are two questions that are similar, so I'll ask them at the same time. So the first one is from Mark Crayson, and he's asking, were many of the Siberian survivors suffering from PTSD? And then we have Teresa, who's also asking something similar, saying, could it be generational not to talk about difficulties? Perhaps our generation is more apt to discuss everything openly.
Yeah, maybe if I could respond to that. So the first part, of course, in those days, people didn't know if they had PTSD. It wasn't well diagnosed. And unless you went for treatment, you wouldn't know. So my suspicion is that most wouldn't know if they had effects of this. What we do know from research just of population, say in Poland, who were born before or during the war, and there's one, I think, in Austria and Germany. They've looked at rates of PTSD now for people who were simply born at that time and found, 10, 20 times more than the usual population. So it tells us two things. Firstly, that it's long lasting. And secondly, that if you were born around that time, it's highly likely you were in a country which was overrun and had very difficult circumstances, you're highly likely to have had PTSD at some level. It may not have been at the really clinical level, but some symptoms of it. So I would think it was highly prevalent in the Siberian deportees, but would not have been diagnosed or treated. So they were managing it. And I think there were various resilience factors that allowed them to sort of manage it. Probably some didn't, but haven't read large accounts of there being large amounts of severe mental illness in this group. So I think it was sort of managed. And the second point about whether the inability to speak might be generational, I think it's a really interesting one, because I think there are other examples of how in earlier generations there was an ethos that you don't speak about your problems, you don't talk about woes and difficult things, you keep that to yourself and you manage, and you don't appear weak or that you have this neediness. And I also think we subsequent generations have been more what I would call psychologically minded. So interpreting their experience more in psychological ways, in emotional ways, or in terms of their mental health or psychological processes. So I think that may also have been a characteristic of an earlier generation, that they were just very stoical and didn't think talking about it did any good. So I think that is there's probably something in that as well.
Julia, Stefan, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just support Antonia's statement about the culture of the generation. If I look at my grandmothers and even my parents' generation, who had my parents had lived through the war as children, and they wouldn't talk, and it would have been perceived as a weakness to talk. It would have been admitted to a personal failure, and then you always had this, but others were even worse off. So it was something that you had no right to be traumatized or hurt or put yourself in the middle, in the center of attention by bemoaning your fate. Yeah, it was stoical without the philosophical background. It was more like, stiff upper lip, as the English say. This probably contributed to kind of what he said about the other framework around it that came on top, that you wouldn't talk.
And just a follow-up question to you, Julia. Teresa is asking again, how did you become interested in this history? Is there a family tie?
I lived in London for a while, and I was in a canoeing club there, and one of my co-canoers had this Polish last name, and I asked him how he came to London. That was before Poland joined the EU, and it was normal to have Polish last names. And then he told me the story and said it's a forgotten genocide. His parents came through Africa, and then I just became interested in this history. I studied Eastern European history, and I found that quite curious, because actually in Germany it's not very well known as part of history. In Germany you focus very much on all the atrocities that the German Reich did in Poland, but a lot of German people wouldn't even know that the eastern part was occupied by the Soviet Union. It's a bit of a moralic thing. It's like you don't want to come across as someone who tries to relativize the atrocities of Germany. While I always think atrocities are atrocities, and you should openly talk about all atrocities to prevent that they ever happen again. Anyway, as I lived in England for 10 years or something, it was a history that kind of I came across again and again. Once it's a bit like serendipity. Once you came across the story once, funnily enough, you meet in the next pub another person, kind of you scratch the surface and a pole emerges, something like that. Because in London there are a lot of these, demobilized Anders Army, for example, occupied half of Western London. So it's not unlikely that you meet Polish people having similar stories. Yeah.
There are a lot of comments and a lot of questions, so we might not be able to get through all of them. But I have a question from Zvinka. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Zvinka.
Zvinka. Okay. And then so they're saying, thanks a lot for those excellent presentations. It's absolutely fascinating. I am Ukrainian, born in Lviv. The territories that Snyder named Bloodlands have gone through so much Holocaust, deportations. Most of those traumatic events happened with the same people living on the same territories, but usually analyzed separately. Do you know of any research that would analyze interconnectedness between those traumas? Stefan, Julia, Antonia, yes? Yes.
Okay.
Antonia.
Yeah, okay. There is research on each of those. So there is, I've read some really interesting papers on the Holodomor and how it affected communication patterns and a sort of overprotectiveness of children. This is the starvation that occurred under Stalin, and hoarding food and eating and lots of narrative about that in families. So we've got the Holocaust stories, we've got Holodomor, and I think there may be others. But interestingly, I haven't read anything that pulls these together to look. I mean, they refer to each other, but I've never seen one pulled together. And I think that's a really interesting observation and something that we might think about. I've got colleagues in both Israel and Ukraine who are interested in these topics, and I think it would be a great thing to put together something that does combine them, see if we can understand more from looking at the different approaches to these experiences. Yeah, it's a good question.
One of the latest research on the deportations focused on the Jewish people who were deported. And this is a sort of very unknown interconnectedness. In the third wave of the deportations, there were a lot of Jewish people who were deported because these were refugees from the Western occupied part. And these were Jewish people who fled Nazi Germany and fled into the Soviet zone of occupation because they thought it might be slightly better there. And then in a big roundup in the third wave of deportations, these Jewish refugees were deported and then by a strange whim of history survived the Holocaust because they had been victims of Stalin before. So Stalin, by a very strange irony of fate, it's well known that he was not a philo-Semite, was Stalin, but he became the savior of European Jewry because they then survived in a harsh exile the Holocaust that then happened when Nazi Germany overran the eastern part of Poland also. So this is a sort of interconnectedness that kind of connects the Polish deportations with the Holocaust. And it's Artina Grossman having done a lot of research on that, and in Australian Centre Monash University in Australia.
Can I
Stefan,
make a
did
comment?
You want to add? Yes.
Yeah. No, in fact, I just want to pick up on some of the points that Julia mentioned, and I'm reminded, in fact, of some of the discussions I've had with my father, other deportees from Ozu, and also this like cynical approach that if they weren't deported, they would have been massacred by the Germans. But, it's like, well, it's a good thing we deported and we survived. If we didn't get deported, the Germans would have murdered us. So I get to come to terms with that kind of logic. You know, it's almost this perverted logic. But I want to go back to Javinka Kochu's commentary and so on about interconnectedness between the traumas. Now, Javinka is president of the Ukrainian Association of South Africa, and Javinka and myself, we are in discussions in terms of how the Polish Association of Deportees and the Ukrainian Association can collaborate in various projects. And yes, there is connectedness. There is a common history, there's common heritage. To be blunt, we have a common aggressor. And it's a case of we are looking at how do we collaborate together on taking things forward to develop a common remembrance. And part of, let's say, Stalin's plans, if I can put it that, was the Holodomor, where I think maybe 3 to 6 million Ukrainians were starved to death. So yeah, that's just what I want to comment about Timothy Snyder's book, the Bloodlands. In fact, the Bloodlands, a lot of that was in the Crescia, and I remember listening to Timothy Snyder talking about his book, The Bloodlands, and he says, yeah, the Second World War literally stretched from England through to Vladivostok, and there's this like narrow strip of land, the Crescia region, what they call the Bloodlands, and that's where massive amounts of massacres, murders, and horrific events happened.
So we are, thank you for that. We are approaching the end of our time, but I just want to ask another question. So Tali has a follow-up question saying, I also wonder about the very late acknowledgement of this history through museums or memorials. Only 50 to 60 years after the deportations, did this play a role as well? I don't know who can answer that.
Maybe I can start.
Okay.
Part of the, right, for much of East and Central Europe, the Second World War only ended with the collapse of communism and totalitarianism. And much of it, so technically speaking, for Poland, the Second World War ended in 1989. Prior to 1989, under communism and totalitarianism, topics like the deportations, topics like the Katyn massacres were taboo. It was, you couldn't talk about it. So essentially, since 1990, I think the Poles are now, we're getting together, and from my perspective, we lost 50 years of trying to catch up on history because the Poles were not allowed to write the history. Now it's up to, I think that's part of the challenge of the second generation is to write that history and to write those narratives.
Well, I would like to add, that's the thing about the cultural and the collective memory. Commonly, memory is perceived as something natural. You know, you have like a storage in your brain, and if it's full, you forget other things. But it's not like that. Memory is constructed. And to something to become collective memory, you need a framework. And the framework was not given. As Stefan was saying, it was taboo, it was pushed up. You couldn't get access to the archives. In Poland, you were not allowed to talk about the deportations for not offending the communists, etc. And only after 1989, you have the framework that allows for a collective memory of that to form. And you still have this little bit of communicative memory, that is the intergenerational memory that still exists, and a collective memory is forming of that you have the idea of being a group of deportation survivors. Because I think that's the other thing I gathered in the interviews. People not necessarily had a feeling of being a group together. They might have known one other Pole or two. It was probably strongest in London, where a big group had the common experience of having been in the Anders army. But apart from that, you didn't feel like we are a group of deportation survivors. And this is only now, strange enough, that the living generation is dying. Only now it is forming. Tragically.
Yes, Antonia, you are muted.
And to unmute, yeah. If I could follow up on that, I agree with you. And this is why the time periods are so interesting, really, that it's as though, because people can remember and talk about it now, it's like it happened recently, which is also a kind of a trauma thing about when it happened. But I have been very impressed going to Warsaw to see how many museums, how many memorials there are, and how much, you know, if I talk now to my Polish friends and colleagues, they all know it. I don't know if that would have been true years ago. And of course, Katyn in the same category, new Katyn Museum, which is extraordinarily good in the Citadel in Warsaw, and that has one floor which is also dedicated to the Siberian and a lot about them. So it's catching up, but it's been a long gap in between, and that's why our generation need to step up to this as well, I think.
Wow. So the rest of the comments are just saying thank you for a wonderful presentation. This was very enlightening. This was very important. And many people are thanking you for saying they don't feel like they are alone in their search of their history. So this has been very helpful for them as descendants. They don't feel like they are just in that little corner. So I think this is a good point for us to close the session. So thank you. Is there anything, just in closing, Antonia, Julia, Stefan, that you would like to say, just as a way to close off the session?
I'll have one thing to say.
Yeah.
See you next year.
Yes, hopefully in person.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Well, just a big thank you for organizing it and for inviting me. It's been so interesting hearing Julia's presentation and all of the comments. And just to let you know, because I do lecture on trauma in London, I now include this stuff. So, you know, gradually, hopefully we can get some of these stories embedded. So there's a group of London students who know all about this and the Holodomor and all the rest. So yeah, we get the story out.
Thank you, Antonia.
Thank you too. And I think it's extremely important, and it adds to the sense of, yeah, being, well, I'm not part of the family, I'm just a researcher from the outside, but I think it's very important to feel what I said, to have a structure, to have a framework that supports the collective memory, and that's an act of healing as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us. There will be a recording that will be available of this webinar. We will post it on our YouTube channel. And for those of you who did register, you will get a recording of this webinar. And then on the 24th of November, we will have another webinar, but we will update you on our future webinars through our emails and of course our website, which is www.jhbholocaust.co.za. Thank you very much. Good evening, good night, good morning. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.